This morning, as I wandered through the park, the air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of freshly cut grass and roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cart. My knees ached a little, as they always do these days, but I didn't mind. I've learned that aches and creaks are the body's way of reminding you how much road you've walked. And then I saw him, a young photographer, crouched low, snapping pictures of a young couple and their toddler. The little girl was squealing, chasing pigeons across the pavement, her parents laughing in a way that only youth allows. For a moment, the flash of the camera, the way that young man was trying to trap time in an image, it struck me like lightning. It pulled me backward, decades into a world I thought I'd folded away neatly. It reminded me of when I wasn't just an old man walking through a park, but a boy with paint under his fingernails and dreams so large I thought they'd carry me out of my own skin. I was born in 1958 in a small American town where everything smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and Sunday dinners. My father worked with his hands, building furniture in the garage. His palms always cracked and rough. My mother kept the house humming, filling it with the aroma of bread and polish. Her voice often carried on the radio tunes of Patsy Cline or Elvis. I wasn't like my brothers. They were loud, strong, always chasing balls and climbing trees. I was quieter, more restless in a different way. I remember the first time I held a brush, one of my father's old paintbrushes he used to finish furniture. I dipped it into a tin of leftover paint and dragged it across the side of a cardboard box. It was crude, sloppy, but it felt like magic. The color transformed something ordinary into something alive. From that moment on, I knew, though I couldn't have explained it then, that my life would always be about capturing the things I felt, the things I saw, the moments that slipped too easily through human fingers. The other boys teased me, called me dreamer, sometimes worse. Teachers looked at me with raised eyebrows when I doodled in the margins of math homework. But when I was alone, sketching in the attic or trying to mix the right shade of sky with leftover house paint, I felt more whole than anywhere else. And now, as I stood in that park at 65, watching that photographer freeze a family's laughter in time, I felt the same stirring I did as a boy. The ache of memory, the pull of creation, the bittersweet weight of knowing how fast it all goes. That moment was the spark, and like all sparks in life, it lit a fuse that led me back through the long, winding road of who I was, who I became, and how painting shaped every step I took. As a teenager, my world felt both too small and impossibly wide. Small because our town was the kind where everybody knew your father's name and what kind of truck he drove. Wide because inside my chest there was this wild hunger to see more, to capture more than the streets I walked every day. I remember sitting in the back of history class sketching the teacher's profile in my notebook instead of taking notes on the Civil War. The curve of his jaw, the slump of his shoulders, that's what fascinated me. Lines and shadows said more about a man than dates and battles ever could. When the teacher caught me, he didn't scold, he just looked at the sketch, then back at me and muttered, "You've got an eye, son. Don't waste it." Those words lit something in me, though I didn't dare tell my father. My father believed in work you could measure. Tables that stood solid, chairs that held weight. He used to shake his head at my drawings and say, "Art won't feed a family." I can't blame him now. He had grown up in harder times where you worked with your hands until they cracked, because there wasn't room for dreams. But at 16, his words felt like a chain around my neck. There was one place I felt free: the old abandoned train depot at the edge of town. The walls there were covered in peeling paint and rust, but it became my sanctuary. I'd sneak out at night with a flashlight and sketchbook, sitting on the cold concrete floor, drawing everything: the freight trains rolling by, the shadows of stray cats, the moonlight bouncing off steel tracks. It was quiet, except for the far. I enrolled in a small program downtown, a place with high ceilings and floors permanently stained with paint. The first time I walked in, the scent of turpentine and varnish hit me so hard I thought, yes, this is where I belong. Students huddled over canvases, the air alive with the scratch of charcoal and the splash of color. It was intoxicating. But the city wasn't forgiving. Rent chewed up my savings faster than I'd expected. My apartment was a dingy studio above a laundromat, the hum of dryers below serving as my nightly lullaby. I took odd jobs to get by: washing dishes, carrying crates in warehouses, anything that let me keep buying paints and canvases. My meals were often cheap diner sandwiches or canned soup, but I didn't mind. Hunger sharpened me. Art school was both exhilarating and brutal. Professors dissected my work with sharp tongues. "Too sentimental," one said, looking at a portrait of my mother. "Too safe," another muttered as they dismissed a landscape I'd poured weeks into. I'd walk back to my apartment some nights with my canvases under my arm, feeling as if I'd been gutted. And yet, every morning, I'd pick up the brush again. There was something stubborn in me, something that wouldn't let go. I found companionship in a few classmates, other dreamers, other stubborn fools. We'd stay up late, sketching each other, debating color theory as if it were politics, smoking cheap cigarettes on the fire escape while the city buzzed below. One of them, a wiry kid named Frank, became like a brother to me. He believed in my work even when I didn't. "You've got something real, man," he'd say. "Don't let 'em beat it out of you." But doubt always hovered. I'd look out my window at night, the neon lights bleeding into the dark, and wonder if I was chasing shadows. My father's words echoed: "Art won't feed a family." I wasn't sure if I was building a life or just delaying the inevitable. Still, I painted. I painted until my hands cramped and my eyes blurred. I painted because the canvas was the only place I could be fully myself. The city was harsh, but it also fed me with sights, sounds, and faces that begged to be captured. Every subway ride, every street corner, every tired face under a street lamp, it was all color and story waiting to be told. Looking back, those years were both the hardest and the most thrilling of my life. They carved me, tested me, and taught me that art was not just a dream, it was survival. It was the smell that did it, the mingling of varnish and sawdust inside a cramped gallery on 8th Avenue that made me feel, for the first time, like maybe I belonged. Frank had dragged me there one Friday evening, insisting I bring along a couple of my paintings. I remember arguing with him the whole walk, my hands sweaty against the wooden stretchers of my paintings. "No one's going to care," I muttered. "They'll laugh me out of the room." But Frank wouldn't let up. He had that kind of faith in me I couldn't summon for myself. The gallery was no grand cathedral of art. It was more like a converted storage space, walls patched and uneven, the lighting harsh in some corners and dim in others. But to me, it felt electric.
Local artists lined the walls with everything from abstract splatters to delicate sketches. The air buzzed with conversation, people in thrift store jackets rubbing shoulders with men in sharp suits, wine glasses sloshing as they gestured and argued about brush strokes. I hung back, clutching my canvases like shields. Finally, the gallery owner, a tall woman with paint-smeared hands herself, looked me up and down and said, "What have you got there?" My throat tightened, but I unwrapped one of the paintings, a portrait of a subway saxophonist I'd seen so many nights, his head tilted back, eyes closed, music practically pouring off the canvas. She stared at it longer than I expected. Then she leaned in, so close I thought she was going to smell the paint, and whispered, "Raw. That's good. Leave it here." I walked out of that gallery lighter than air. I didn't care if anyone bought it. I'd left a piece of myself on the wall of a real gallery in New York City. But someone did buy it. A middle-aged man with tired eyes, the kind of man who looked like life had beaten him down more than once. He said the portrait reminded him of his brother, a musician who died too young. His voice broke as he handed me a wad of bills, more money than I'd ever seen come from my art. I stood there speechless, while he said softly, "Thank you for painting him, even though you never knew him." That was the moment I understood. Art wasn't just for me. It wasn't just about scratching an itch inside my chest. It was a bridge between me and strangers, between memory and reality, between loss and comfort. The recognition was small, but it ignited something. Suddenly, people who had walked past me on the street now stopped to ask about commissions. A cafe owner wanted murals. A couple wanted their wedding portrait. The money was meager, never steady, but every time I traded canvas for cash, I felt like I'd won a quiet war. But with that came pressure. The joy of painting purely for myself began to tangle with the expectations of others. Clients wanted smiles on faces that felt wrong, or colors brighter than truth. I'd sit staring at half-finished commissions, wondering if I was betraying myself or if this was simply the price of survival. Still, I kept painting late into the nights, long after the commissions were done. Those secret canvases, the unrequested, unapproved ones, were my salvation. Faces of strangers I'd glimpsed on the subway. The rain-soaked glow of neon signs at midnight. My own hands, garled and stained with paint, trembling but stubborn. That was my 20s, nights filled with creation and doubt. Days split between chasing money and chasing truth. And though I often wondered if I could keep living like that, every morning the answer was the same. I picked up the brush. It was in a cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and old wood that I first saw her.
I enrolled in a small program downtown, a place with high ceilings and floors permanently stained with paint. The first time I walked in, the scent of turpentine and varnish hit me so hard I thought, yes, this is where I belong. Students huddled over canvases, the air alive with the scratch of charcoal and the splash of color. It was intoxicating. But the city wasn't forgiving. Rent chewed up my savings faster than I'd expected. My apartment was a dingy studio above a laundromat, the hum of dryers below serving as my nightly lullaby. I took odd jobs to get by, washing dishes, carrying crates in warehouses, anything that let me keep buying paints and canvases. My meals were often cheap diner sandwiches or canned soup, but I didn't mind. Hunger sharpened me. Art school was both exhilarating and brutal. Professors dissected my work with sharp tongues. "Too sentimental," one said, looking at a portrait of my mother. "Too safe," another muttered as they dismissed the landscape I'd poured weeks into. I'd walk back to my apartment some nights with my canvases under my arm, feeling as if I'd been gutted. And yet, every morning, I'd pick up the brush again. There was something stubborn in me, something that wouldn't let go. I found companionship in a few classmates, other dreamers, other stubborn fools. We'd stay up late, sketching each other, debating color theory as if it were politics, smoking cheap cigarettes on the fire escape while the city buzzed below. One of them, a wiry kid named Frank, became like a brother to me. He believed in my work even when I didn't. "You've got something real, man. Don't let them beat it out of you." But doubt always hovered. I'd look out my window at night, the neon lights bleeding into the dark, and wonder if I was chasing shadows. My father's words echoed, "Art won't feed a family." I wasn't sure if I was building a life or just delaying the inevitable. Still, I painted. I painted until my hands cramped and my eyes blurred. I painted because the canvas was the only place I could be fully myself. The city was harsh, but it also fed me with sights, sounds, and faces that begged to be captured. Every subway ride, every street corner, every tired face under a street lamp, it was all color and story waiting to be told. Looking back, those years were both the hardest and the most thrilling of my life. They carved me, tested me, and taught me that art was not just a dream, it was survival. It was the smell that did it. The mingling of varnish and sawdust inside a cramped gallery on 8th Avenue that made me feel, for the first time, like maybe I belonged. Frank had dragged me there one Friday evening, insisting I bring along a couple of my canvases. I remember arguing with him the whole walk, my hands sweaty against the wooden stretchers of my paintings. "No one's going to care," I muttered. "They'll laugh me out of the room." But Frank wouldn't let up. He had that kind of faith in me I couldn't summon for myself. The gallery was no grand cathedral of art. It was more like a converted storage space, walls patched and uneven, the lighting harsh in some corners and dim in others. But to me, it felt electric. Local artists lined the walls with everything from abstract splatters to delicate sketches. The air buzzed with conversation. People in thrift store jackets rubbing shoulders with men in sharp suits, wine glasses sloshing as they gestured and argued about brushstrokes. I hung back, clutching my canvases like shields. Finally, the gallery owner, a tall woman with paint-smeared hands herself, looked me up and down and said, "What you got there?" My throat tightened, but I unwrapped one of the paintings. A portrait of a subway saxophonist I'd seen so many nights. His head tilted back, eyes closed. Music practically pouring off the canvas. She stared at it longer than I expected. Then she leaned in, so close I thought she was going to smell the paint, and whispered, "Raw. That's good. Leave it here." I walked out of that gallery lighter than air. I didn't care if anyone bought it. I'd left a piece of myself on the wall of a real gallery in New York City. But someone did buy it. A middle-aged man with tired eyes. The kind of man who looked like life had beaten him down more than once. He said the portrait reminded him of his brother, a musician who died too young. His voice broke as he handed me a wad of bills, more money than I'd ever seen come from my art. I stood there speechless, while he said softly, "Thank you for painting him, even though you never knew him." That was the moment I understood. Art wasn't just for me. It wasn't just about scratching an itch inside my chest. It was a bridge between me and strangers, between memory and reality, between loss and comfort. The recognition was small, but it ignited something. Suddenly, people who had walked past me on the street now stopped to ask about commissions. A cafe owner wanted murals, a couple wanted their wedding portrait. The money was meager, never steady, but every time I traded canvas for cash, I felt like I'd won a quiet war. But with that came pressure. The joy of painting purely for myself began to tangle with the expectations of others. Clients wanted smiles on faces that felt wrong, or colors brighter than truth. I'd sit staring at half-finished commissions, wondering if I was betraying myself, or if this was simply the price of survival. Still, I kept painting. I painted until my hands cramped and my eyes blurred. I painted because the canvas was the only place I could be fully myself. The city was harsh, but it also fed me with sights, sounds, and faces that begged to be captured. Every subway ride, every street corner, every tired face under a street lamp, it was all color and story waiting to be told. It was in a cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and old wood that I first saw her. Her name was Margaret, though she told everyone to call her Maggie. She had auburn hair tied back in a loose knot, strands always slipping free to frame her face. She was sitting at a corner table, sketchbook open, her pencil moving quickly, almost furiously, as if she were trying to catch the world before it slipped away. I watched her for too long, I'm sure of it. Finally, she caught me staring, and instead of scowling, she smiled. A quick, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. I mustered the courage to walk over, stammering something foolish about her sketching. She pushed the book toward me. On the page was a man hunched over a newspaper, his wrinkles captured with such honesty it almost hurt to look at him. We talked until the cafe closed. She was an art student too, but where I was obsessed with paint, she loved ink, pencil, and line. She said color distracted her. She wanted the bones of the world, the skeleton beneath. I laughed and said I wanted the flesh, the blood, the light. Somehow we fit together, opposites on the same canvas. Maggie and I fell hard and fast. Those were the days when love felt like gasoline poured on everything. Meals were shared out of a single bowl, rent split in apartments that smelled of mildew and turpentine, nights spent on rooftops talking about the future as if it were something we could paint into existence. She became my muse in a way I never believed in before. I painted her endlessly, her face half lit by the glow of a street lamp, her hands curled around a teacup, her back turned as she leaned over her sketchbook. She never posed for me. She just lived, and I painted her living. But love between two artists isn't simple. We were both stubborn, both chasing something larger than ourselves. When my paintings began getting noticed, small shows, a magazine feature, Maggie grew quieter. I didn't see it at first. I thought she was proud, that she shared in my victories. But the truth is, her own work was being overlooked, and while people patted me on the back, she was left in the shadows. Arguments began like hairline cracks. She accused me of being consumed by my own ego, of painting for praise instead of for truth. I accused her of jealousy, of not supporting me when the world finally started to open its doors. The words were sharp, the kind that leave wounds that never fully close. Still, there were moments of sweetness. I remember a winter night when the radiator in our apartment died. We huddled under blankets, our breath fogging the air, and she whispered, "Promise me we'll never stop making art, no matter what happens." I kissed her cold lips and said I promised. But promises are fragile things. By the time I turned 30, our love had burned itself out. She left one morning with her sketchbooks tucked under her arm, and I didn't stop her. I told myself it was for the best, that two flames burning too close were bound to consume each other. But truthfully, the apartment felt hollow without her, the silence deafening. I painted through the heartbreak, as I always did. The canvases grew darker, the colors heavier, as if I could bury my grief under layers of paint. And yet those paintings, the ones born from Maggie's absence, were the ones that sold. People said they felt something deep in them, a kind of honesty I hadn't shown before. Funny, isn't it? Sometimes your greatest losses carve the space for your most powerful work. Success came to me quietly at first, like a tide creeping up the shore before you realize you're standing knee-deep in it. After Maggie left, I threw myself into painting with a kind of desperation. I barely slept. The canvases piled up against the walls of my apartment until there was no space to walk. The air smelled perpetually of turpentine, coffee, and stale cigarettes. I lived like a man possessed. Then one day, a gallery owner, different from the cramped little place Frank had dragged me to years earlier, came to see my work. She walked into my apartment, her heels clicking against the warped wooden floor, and she just stood there, silent, scanning the rows of canvases. I felt my throat close up. Finally, she turned to me and said, "You're not ready for the big shows yet, but you will be. Keep painting." Those words were oxygen. Within a year, I was a part of group exhibitions in Soho. My name started appearing in small reviews, sometimes just a sentence or two, but enough to feel real. People began calling me an up-and-coming artist, though I never felt like I was coming up anywhere. I just kept painting. The first time someone paid thousands for one of my pieces, I nearly fainted. I'd grown so used to scrapping together rent, to living off ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, that the idea of someone valuing my vision enough to hand over that kind of money felt surreal. I held the check in my hands, staring at it like it was a foreign object. But with recognition came a new kind of pressure. Collectors wanted more. Galleries wanted something that fit neatly into the style that they'd begun to magnify me for. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to follow my instincts. There were expectations. Unspoken, but heavy. My canvases began to sell before I'd even touched the brush, and people asked, "What's next? What's bigger? What's new?" The loneliness hit hardest at the openings. Rooms full of strangers sipping wine, murmuring over my work as if it were a specimen under glass.
I tried to hold on to that. But the truth is, success is a tricky thing. It feels good, intoxicating even, but it demands pieces of you in return. And I began to wonder, was I painting what I saw, or what I thought others wanted me to see? The applause grew louder, but inside, I couldn't shake the echo of Maggie's voice whispering, "Promise me we'll never stop making art, no matter what happens." And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was keeping that promise. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the most unremarkable of places, a hardware store. I was there looking for a hammer, of all things. My landlord had finally refused to fix the crooked cabinet in my kitchen, and I'd grown tired of balancing dishes on a slant. I wandered down the aisle smelling of sawdust and paint thinner, scanning tools I didn't know how to use. And there she was, Evelyn. She was standing a few feet away, comparing light bulbs with the same intensity I used to compare shades of paint. She had this calm about her,
a kind of groundedness that seemed rare in New York City. No frantic rush, no distracted scrolling through a phone, just focus, steady and real. I don't know why I spoke to her. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the universe nudging me. I said something foolish about how many watts it took to brighten a crooked kitchen. She laughed, not politely, not out of pity, but a real laugh, warm and unguarded. That laugh became the beginning of something I hadn't expected at all. Evelyn wasn't an artist. She was a nurse. Her world was measured in heartbeats, blood pressure, and quiet patience with the sick and the scared. She didn't care about gallery openings or critics. In fact, she barely understood why people paid so much for paintings when they could hang photographs on their walls. But she listened to me, really listened. And more than that, she reminded me of life outside the canvas. With her, things slowed down. Our dates were simple. Picnics in Central Park, cups of tea in tiny cafes, evenings spent cooking in her small apartment that always smelled faintly of lavender. I'd watch her chop vegetables with steady hands, and for the first time in years, I felt myself unclench. I started painting her too, of course, not as a muse, not as the fire Maggie had been, but as an anchor. Evelyn wasn't someone who consumed me. She steadied me. In my canvases, she appeared surrounded by warm earth tones, her face calm, her eyes steady, her presence like a soft weight that held me to the ground when the art world tried to pull me apart. But love wasn't without its challenges. Evelyn wanted stability. She worked long shifts at the hospital, and when she came home exhausted, the last thing she needed was a man lost in his head, brooding over whether his brushstroke carried the right kind of honesty. I struggled with that balance. There were arguments about money, about time, about whether I could be present in the everyday, or whether I'd always vanish into my own world. Still, we stayed. We chose each other. And in choosing her, I began to see something I'd never really considered before. A future that wasn't just made of paint and canvas, but of shared breakfasts, laughter, and maybe even a family. For a man who had spent so many years chasing the fleeting applause of strangers, the idea of building something steady, something lasting, felt both terrifying and miraculous. And it was with Evelyn that the next chapter of my life truly began, the one where art and love had to learn how to share the same space. Evelyn and I were married on a mild spring afternoon in a little church tucked between brick row houses. It wasn't grand, no chandeliers, no orchestra, no towering floral displays, just a few close friends, her co-workers from the hospital, Frank by my side as my best man, and sunlight streaming through stained glass windows that painted the aisle in blues and reds. I remember my hands shaking as I slipped the ring on her finger. She didn't cry. Evelyn wasn't the crying type. But she squeezed my hand in a way that told me, this is real. This is us. Married life wasn't easy, not for an artist and a nurse scraping by in the city. My paintings were starting to sell more regularly, but art money came in waves, booms of sales followed by months of silence. Evelyn's paycheck kept us afloat when mine didn't. I hated it sometimes, hated feeling like I wasn't pulling enough weight, but she never complained. She'd just smile and say, "Paint, that's your work. Leave the rest to me." When our first child was born, a boy we named Daniel, I felt something shift inside me.
I held him in that hospital room, Evelyn's face pale with exhaustion, but glowing with a quiet pride, and for the first time I realized how small I was in the grand scheme of things. My life had always revolved around colors, textures, expression, but looking at Daniel, tiny and perfect, I knew art was only part of my purpose.
I kept showing my work in small galleries, but it was harder now. Time wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to them. And though part of me feared I'd lose myself in fatherhood, another part of me found a deeper well to paint from. My canvases shifted. They weren't just portraits of strangers or abstract emotions. They became windows into the life we were building. A father holding a child against his chest. A woman folding laundry in the golden light of dusk. Children's toys scattered against worn floorboards. Critics called it domestic realism. I called it survival. There were nights I'd sit in the half-dark, staring at Evelyn as she slept, children breathing softly down the hall, and I'd feel something I could never put into words. Something bigger than applause, bigger than art shows. Love, yes, but also a fragile terror, the fear of losing it, the fear of not being enough. And I think that's when I began to understand. Art wasn't about chasing recognition anymore. It was about holding on to what mattered before it slipped away. The years that followed were a blur of diapers, paint-stained rags, and exhaustion. But somewhere in that blur, my work began to take on a life of its own. It started small. A local gallery owner stopped by one of my group shows and asked if I could bring in more pieces. She liked the way I captured ordinary intimacy, she said. The chipped teacups on a breakfast table, the way children leaned into their mother's side, the quiet tenderness in things most people overlooked. I smiled politely, but inside I thought, of course that's what I paint. That's the life I live. Soon one gallery led to another. My name appeared in small reviews and art magazines. Not the glossy covers, but the back pages, the sections most people skipped. Still, for me, it was proof that someone out there was listening. By the time Daniel was in elementary school, I was invited to a solo show in Manhattan, my first. I'll never forget that night. The smell of wine and perfume, the echo of shoes clicking on polished floors, my canvases hanging like pieces of my soul against white walls. Evelyn wore a dress I could barely afford, her hair pinned up, tired from her hospital shift, but radiant nonetheless. She stood by my side, smiling with quiet pride, even though I knew she'd rather be home with the children. People asked me questions I didn't always know how to answer. What does this painting represent? Is this commentary on domestic fragility? Do you consider yourself part of the new American realism movement? I wanted to laugh. I wanted to say, no, that's just my kitchen table after a long day. But I nodded, gave them thoughtful answers, played the role of the artist they wanted me to be. The money started to trickle in. Not riches, never riches, but enough to ease the pressure. Enough to buy new shoes for the kids without hesitation. Enough to take Evelyn out to dinner now and then without worrying what it would do to the grocery budget. But with recognition came the pull. Invitations to more shows. Critics urging me to elevate my subject matter. Collectors suggesting they'd pay more if I returned to bolder, larger canvases, the kind I used to paint before fatherhood slowed me down. I was torn. On one side, the life I craved, the messy beauty of my wife and children, evenings filled with small rituals and quiet laughter. On the other, the art world, tugging me toward ambition, recognition, a chance to be more than just a painter of domestic scenes. And I'll admit, I stumbled. There were times I stayed too long at receptions, sipping wine with strangers who spoke in lofty words about things they'd never lived. Times I came home late, Evelyn asleep on the couch with the TV still glowing, the kids' homework scattered on the table. And I felt the guilt gnawing at me, wondering if I was chasing something that would never give back as much as it took. But then there were mornings. Daniel running to me with a drawing he'd made. Grace tugging at my sleeve asking me to braid her doll's hair when I knew what truly mattered. Those moments would steady me. They reminded me that recognition could fade, money could vanish, critics could turn their backs. But this life, this family, was my masterpiece. And yet, the tug of ambition never left. It haunted me, whispering late at night when the house was still, "You could be more. You could be great." It was the beginning of a tension that would define much of the next decade, between love and ambition, home and gallery, heart and canvas. The tension built slowly, like a storm moving in over the Hudson, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Evelyn was exhausted more often than not. Nights at the hospital stretched long, and our apartment never seemed to quiet itself. Toys littered the floors, dishes piled up, and I, caught in my obsession with deadlines, commissions, and gallery demands, sometimes forgot to be present. I thought I was providing, but I was also absent. Daniel and Grace noticed. Their questions became sharper, their little complaints less about toys and more about time. "Daddy, will you be home for dinner?" Daniel asked one evening, eyes wide and pleading, as I returned from a late gallery talk. I mumbled, yes, but we ate in near silence, the weight of my broken promise pressing down on all of us. The art world, meanwhile, didn't pause. Invitations, exhibitions, and critics' letters piled up. People wanted the next big thing, the evolution of my style, a bolder statement. Each show demanded more energy, more late nights, more compromise. My paintings began to reflect that strain, faces tinged with
Friendships frayed. Frank, my lifelong anchor, grew quiet in the face of my obsession. He understood ambition, but he saw how it was eating me from the inside out. "You're chasing ghosts," he said one night in the diner where we often met. "Remember why you started painting in the first place." I nodded, but the words sank in unevenly. Evelyn confronted me one evening after a particularly long gallery opening. She was tired, worn, and her voice held a firmness I hadn't heard before. "I can't keep living like this," she said. "We're losing the children, and I'm losing you." Her words hit me like cold rain. I saw my reflection in her eyes, someone I didn't want to be. A man torn between his dreams and the life he'd built, drifting further from the people he loved most. I took a week off. No galleries, no painting, just home. I helped with homework, cooked dinners, and simply sat with my family. The smell of tomato sauce simmering on the stove, the quiet chatter of Daniel and Grace doing their assignments, Evelyn humming while folding laundry. It grounded me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. And I understood something critical. Art was my life, yes, but it couldn't be my whole life. The world could wait. The people I loved couldn't. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow recalibration, a learning to weave together family and ambition without letting one consume the other. Some days I failed. Some nights I returned to the canvas, fingers stained with paint while the kids slept. But gradually the balance began to emerge. I started painting with a new purpose, not for critics, not for applause, but for life itself. For the laughter of children, the quiet warmth of a spouse, the simple beauty of everyday moments. It was humbling. It was terrifying. And it was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached my 40s, my work had finally begun to find its place in the wider world. Not the glittering cover of a magazine fame I'd once imagined, but a quiet, steady recognition that allowed me to keep painting on my own terms. Gallery invitations came more regularly. Critics began to write in thoughtful tones, no longer just noticing the up-and-comer, but acknowledging the depth in my pieces, the way I captured fleeting moments of family life, the subtleties of light and shadow, the honest portrayal of ordinary people. I remembered the first major review that didn't feel condescending. I held the clipping in my hands, worn and trembling. Evelyn leaned over my shoulder, reading aloud. The artist brings an unparalleled intimacy to his subjects, reminding us that life's smallest moments are its richest. We laughed quietly, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself a small measure of pride without guilt. Family life, of course, never stopped being challenging. Daniel was in high school now, full of energy, questions, and the kind of teenage stubbornness that tested every ounce of patience I had. Grace, on the cusp of adolescence, began exploring her own interests, leaving me to navigate how to support her without smothering her independence. Evelyn and I had long conversations, sometimes heated, sometimes tender, about how to keep our family grounded amid the swirl of exhibitions, deadlines, and the pressures that came with recognition. And yet, every time I returned to the studio, there was a calm that only creation could bring. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine, the way light fell across the unfinished canvas, the slow rhythm of brush against surface, it all reminded me that this was my true refuge. Friends from my early years, Frank included, would visit, and we'd sit in my studio, surrounded by the chaos of paint and brushes, talking about life, art, mistakes, and victories. There were still arguments, regrets, and moments when I questioned my choices, but the foundation had shifted. I was no longer chasing recognition blindly. I was living it deliberately, with eyes wide open. People began to seek my perspective beyond the canvases. Interviews, small lectures, mentorships for younger artists. Each time I felt a responsibility to share what I'd learned, to remind them that art was not only about skill or fame, but about paying attention to life itself, about capturing moments that might otherwise slip away. Yet, beneath all of this, a quiet fear lingered. The fear that I hadn't done enough, that my best work was still ahead of me, or worse, that I'd let life pass by while I pursued recognition. And still I painted, always. I began teaching small workshops, sharing my experience with younger artists who were eager and earnest. It was a different kind of satisfaction, seeing someone struggle with the same questions I'd faced, then watching their eyes light up when they found their own voice. Mentoring became a new kind of creation, one that didn't demand the stamina of a full canvas, but left a lasting imprint all the same. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. I questioned whether my work had truly mattered, whether I'd left a mark beyond the walls of galleries. But then I'd glance at a painting of Daniel reading under the afternoon light, or Grace laughing at the park, and I'd realize that the most important canvases had always been the ones life itself had painted around me. I slowed further as my 60s approached. Commissions became selective, exhibitions fewer but more intentional. My hands sometimes trembled, my eyesight occasionally faltered, but the rhythm of creation never left me. I painted less for the world and more for the quiet joy of making, for the gentle meditation of brush against canvas. And in that slowing, I found clarity. Life, art, family, they were intertwined, inseparable, a tapestry of moments both fleeting and eternal. Turning 60 wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with fanfare or sudden revelation. It came quietly, in the subtle ache of joints, in the gray threads weaving through my hair, in the evenings when I found myself sitting longer in the living room, staring at the walls I had painted so many times.
Retirement from active painting crept in slowly. No single moment marked it, only a gradual acceptance that my hands no longer moved with the same certainty, that my vision of color and light had shifted, softened, sometimes dulled by age. I sold fewer pieces, declined gallery shows, and began passing on my studio space to younger artists eager for their chance. There was a strange mix of relief and grief in letting go. Relief because the constant pressure and endless deadlines faded. Grief because those canvases had been more than work. They had been extensions of myself, mirrors of the life I had lived and loved. The studio, once a chaotic sanctuary, now seemed almost too silent. Yet in that silence, I discovered something new. I started revisiting old works, seeing them not as products of ambition, but as chronicles of my life. The painting of Daniel, clutching a book in the soft afternoon light, reminded me of nights spent reading stories to him, the way his small fingers would press against mine. The portrait of Grace with clay smudged on her cheek recalled mornings of laughter and mess, and Evelyn's patient hands folding laundry beside me in countless canvases told a story of steadfast love. I realized that legacy isn't measured by acclaim or gallery walls. It's in these small, intimate moments, the ones that outlast exhibitions and critics' reviews. My children had grown, carrying pieces of our life and lessons with them. My students had begun to carry echoes of my teaching forward into their own work. My paintings, while fewer now, held decades of life in every brushstroke. Evelyn stayed by my side through it all, quiet but unwavering. She never let me dwell too long on what I could no longer do. Instead, she encouraged me to reflect, to remember, to see the beauty in what I had accomplished. Together, we walked through the parks, visited friends, and spent long, unhurried evenings in the kitchen or the garden. I painted sometimes still, but differently. No pressure, no deadlines, only the gentle exploration of memory and light, the comfort of ritual, and the simple joy of creating. Each stroke was a meditation, each color a conversation with the life I had lived. And in that slowing, I understood something essential. Retirement wasn't an end. It was a new canvas, one that asked only for reflection, gratitude, and the slow, deliberate savoring of life.